Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, has set his sights on a target that has long seemed untouchable: the House of Lords. This antiquated institution, often ridiculed as a bastion of privilege and unelected power, has resisted major reform for far too long. Starmer's proposal seeks to upend the status quo by abolishing hereditary peerages and introducing a more democratic system for appointing members to the upper chamber. The Labour leader's plan has sent shockwaves through the British political establishment. For decades, the House of Lords has operated as a shadowy second chamber, its members largely unaccountable to the public they supposedly serve. Starmer's proposal, if enacted, would represent a seismic shift in British politics. It would reshape the balance of power and potentially pave the way for a more transparent and accountable system of governance. But the road to reform is rarely smooth. Critics, including prominent figures on the right, have accused Starmer of engaging in a partisan power grab. Despite the challenges ahead, Starmer's decision to tackle Lords reform is a sign of his determination to challenge the entrenched power structures that have long dominated British society. To understand the significance of Starmer's proposal, it is essential to grasp the peculiar nature of the House of Lords. Unlike the democratically elected House of Commons, the Lords is a strange mix of appointed life peers and hereditary peers. These hereditary peers, a relic of Britain's feudal past, inherit their seats based solely on their lineage. This means that a select few individuals, by virtue of their birthright, wield significant political power without ever having to face the scrutiny of an election. The presence of hereditary peers in the 21st century is an affront to democratic principles. Defenders of the current system often argue that hereditary peers bring valuable experience and expertise to the legislative process. However, these arguments ring hollow in the face of such blatant inequality. Starmer's proposal to abolish hereditary peerages is not about tearing down tradition for the sake of it. It is about ensuring that the House of Lords reflects the values of modern Britain: fairness, equality and accountability. As expected, Starmer's bold proposal has not been met with universal acclaim. Nigel Farage, the former leader of the UK Independence Party, has been among the most vocal opponents. In his characteristically blunt style, Farage has accused Starmer of attempting a power grab that would consolidate Labour's grip on the levers of power. Farage argues that by abolishing hereditary peerages and introducing an appointed system, Starmer would effectively be able to stack the House of Lords with Labour loyalists. This, he claims, would create an unaccountable chamber beholden to the Labour Party and its agenda. Critics like Farage often point to the perceived left-leaning bias of the British media and academia as evidence of a wider trend towards Labour dominance. Whether these fears are justified remains to be seen. Safeguards will need to be put in place to ensure that the appointment process is transparent, meritocratic and free from undue influence. Starmer's attempt to reform the House of Lords is not the first, and it is unlikely to be the last. The history of the Lords is littered with attempts to modernise this ancient institution and bring it in line with democratic principles. In 1911, the Liberal government of Herbert Henry Asquith passed the Parliament Act, which significantly curtailed the Lords' power to block legislation passed by the House of Commons. This landmark act represented a major step towards a more democratic system of governance, but it did not address the fundamental issue of unelected representation in the House of Lords. Subsequent attempts at reform, such as the Labour government's efforts in the late 1990s to remove most hereditary peers, have met with mixed success. The challenges of Lords reform are numerous and complex. However, the history of Lords reform also offers a glimmer of hope. Despite the setbacks and obstacles, there has been a clear and consistent trend towards a more democratic and accountable second chamber. The potential impact of Starmer's reforms on the House of Lords is significant. Abolishing hereditary peerages would remove a fundamental source of inequality and unelected power from the British political system. This, in turn, could lead to a more democratic and accountable second chamber, one that is more reflective of the will of the people. A reformed House of Lords with a membership based on merit rather than birthright could potentially play a more constructive role in the legislative process. It could provide a valuable forum for scrutinising government policy and offering alternative perspectives. A more diverse and representative chamber could also help to rebuild public trust in the political process. However, it is important to acknowledge that the impact of Starmer's reforms will depend largely on the specifics of his proposal. Simply abolishing hereditary peerages without addressing the issue of appointment could simply shift the balance of power from one unelected elite to another. To ensure that his reforms lead to genuine progress, Starmer must prioritise transparency and accountability in the appointment process. Starmer's motives in pursuing Lord's reform have been the subject of much speculation and debate. Cynics argue that his proposals are nothing more than a cynical ploy to consolidate Labour's power and silence dissenting voices. They point to the fact that Labour has historically benefited from a more pliant House of Lords and argue that Starmer is simply seeking to cement this advantage. Others, however, see Starmer's move as a genuine attempt to modernise the British political system and make it more democratic. They point to his long-standing commitment to social justice and his criticisms of the current system's inherent unfairness. The truth, as is often the case, likely lies somewhere in between these two extremes. It is undeniable that Starmer, as a shrewd political operator, is aware of the potential electoral benefits of Lord's reform. A more democratic and accountable second chamber could help to bolster Labour's image and appeal to voters who are disillusioned with the status quo. However, it is also likely that Starmer is motivated by a genuine desire to address a long-standing democratic deficit in the British political system. While Lord's reform has dominated the headlines, it is important to remember that Starmer's Labour Party is grappling with a range of other pressing issues. One such issue is energy policy, a topic of increasing concern to voters struggling with the rising cost of living. Labour has pledged to address this crisis by investing in renewable energy sources and reducing the UK's dependence on fossil fuels. The party's plans have been welcomed by environmental groups and those concerned about the climate crisis. However, critics argue that Labour's proposals will lead to higher energy bills for ordinary families and businesses. They point to the high upfront costs of renewable energy infrastructure and the potential for job losses in the fossil fuel industry. Labour insists that its plans will ultimately lead to lower energy bills and a more secure energy supply. The debate over energy policy highlights the difficult choices facing Starmer as he seeks to balance competing priorities. The public and political reactions to Starmer's Lord's reform proposals have been mixed. Polls suggest that a majority of the public supports the idea of reforming the House of Lords. However, there is less agreement on what form those reforms should take. Some favour a fully elected second chamber, while others support a more limited system of reform, such as abolishing hereditary peerages but retaining an appointed element. Within the Labour Party, there is broad support for Starmer's proposals. However, some on the left of the party have expressed concerns that the reforms do not go far enough. The Conservative Party, meanwhile, has been largely critical of Starmer's plans. The Liberal Democrats, who have long campaigned for Lord's reform, have welcomed Starmer's proposals but have urged him to go further. The debate over Lord's reform has highlighted the deep divisions within British society over the nature of democracy and the role of the second chamber. Starmer's decision to pursue Lord's reform is a gamble with potentially significant consequences for his leadership and the future of the Labour Party. If successful, the reforms could help to cement his image as a reformer willing to take on vested interests and make the British political system fairer and more democratic. This could appeal to voters who are disillusioned with the status quo and boost Labour's chances of winning the next general election. However, failure to deliver on his promises could damage Starmer's credibility and alienate both those who support reform and those who oppose it. The stakes are high for Starmer and Labour. The outcome of the Lords' reform debate could have a profound impact on the future of British politics.